Well, good evening, everyone. There'll be a number of you logging on now, and I want to thank you for turning up. It's an ask on a Wednesday evening at 7:30, and as you know, we're going to do a deep dive into the model of developmental immaturity, and I'm just going to give people a few minutes to log on and settle in. I hope you're comfy. I want to talk about the model in some detail, and we'd like to give time at the end for questions. So, as I go through the model, if there's questions that you've got, make a note of them or pop them in the comments. And I have a trusty aide here, Kathleen, who's going to monitor me and monitor you. So we'll have a bit of fun this evening. As many of you know, Pia Mellody put together this model largely out of her own trauma a very long time ago when she was working at the Meadows in Phoenix, Arizona, which of course, as you know, is still going. And Pia is alive and well and feisty and still working within the Meadows, which is now quite a big place. South Pacific Private is modelled on the Meadows, and we use the model of developmental immaturity to unpack trauma, to look at the reasons why, addiction has become part of your life, why there's anxiety, why there's process addictions, all sorts of things going on in your life. And many of you that are logged on, I know, would be familiar with it. I just want to show it to you. It's this model here. And when I unpack the model, I actually go across from the nature of a child to the core issues, the primary symptoms, the secondary, and then the functional adult. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. So I tell some stories about how it might be playing out in your life. And I think it's really critical when starting to work with trauma and with addiction to understand what underpins it. So in her world, what she set out was that there were four aspects, four values that the nature of a child had, and these were what children needed for healthy parenting to develop and maintain positive attitudes and beliefs about themselves. And when we're talking about the value system, the first one is you are of value. Now, you are of value as a child, and when we're talking about a child, we're talking sort of 0 to 16, 17. So it's actually a long range of years, and it encompasses a number of ego states, and it encompasses a number of periods in your life where you're transitioning from being very young to toddler to teen, preteen, teen, and then moving into adulthood. And when we're working at South Pacific, say, for example, in changes, when I do most of the unpacking of this model, I talk about the fact that you are of inherent worth. Now, children, they are of value simply because they stand upright and breathe in and out. They don't have to do anything to be of value. They are of value because they are precious, and they don't have to get an A in maths or be captain of the cricket team or look after their siblings or be very, very, very well behaved. They don't have to do anything to be of value. They are of value intrinsically. And if we are of value in a family system, we learn healthy self-esteem. Now, you know what healthy self-esteem is. It's a sense of our own preciousness, comes from inside us, goes out to the world. We talk about it all the time. It's an inside-out job. It's not an outside-in job. And when we're in a state of healthy self-esteem, we know that irrespective of what you're doing to me or what I'm feeling about that, I still am of value. If we are raised in a family system where we're not of value just because we stand upright and breathe in and out, we don't learn healthy self-esteem. We will go to two states. One is less than and the other is better than. Now, when we're talking about the model, about being in wounded child or being in adapted adult child. And if we're in wounded child, we're less than, which is it doesn't matter what I do, it's never going to be good enough. It doesn't matter how well I'm behaved, how many A's I get, and how many times have I heard it that, the child tries really hard, studies really hard, races home to mum and dad or mum and dad and says, I got a B in maths, you know what I mean? Well, why didn't you get an A? You didn't work hard enough. Or, you know, the other classic one is, did you get on the, were you picked on the cricket team? No, it wasn't picked. Well, hang on a second. Why weren't you picked? Didn't you practice hard enough? It doesn't matter what you do, you're always going to be criticised and put down. And so very early in the piece in your life, you'll learn that I am of less value than those who do all of those things. And in your eyes, that being mum and dad's eyes, I am of less value. So I sit in wounded child. Now, if we're on the other side of it, we sit in better than. Now, better than is where we live with a sense of entitlement. This happens to children who generally are raised in family systems where mum or dad's in better than a lot of the time. We would often use the words grandiose or arrogant. And the classic one, of course, and that was what you observe is that it doesn't matter what you do in life, you have to prevail over others. It doesn't matter what message you're getting from anyone outside the home. Within the home, you're told, we are, what are you talking about? We are the Wilsons. We don't put up with that. It doesn't matter what happens. And you see this time and time again, where children are not set limits. They're not set that they need to be right-sized. As Pia would say, you know, your poo stinks like everybody else's, is what she says. Well, she doesn't put it in those words, she puts it in other words, but, you know, I'm trying to be polite. So we're either sitting in less than or better than. Now, if we actually don't learn healthy self-esteem, we'll start to develop some of the secondary and relational symptoms as a result of that, and they can be any of the following things, and it's quite a long list: depression, dishonesty, rage issues, enmeshment, I'll come back to that one, control issues, physical illness, intimacy issues, disordered eating, money disorders, anxiety disorders, spirituality issues, process addictions, which is like gaming and shopping, and chemical addictions, love and avoidance addiction, and problems with interdependence. Now, in South Pacific, we often see people come in with all of a series of those presenting problems. That's the critical issue that has to be addressed first before we can go back and look at the trauma, because if they're still in their active addiction, they're not going to have the bandwidth to be able to look at it. But it's very interesting to get very clear about what your presenting problem is, and it will often be that problem that needs to be addressed first. Until you can, before that, you can't go back and do the trauma work. It's not going to be possible. So what we want to do from the point of self-esteem is get to a place where I esteem myself from within. Now, it sounds really easy, doesn't it? 4 words: esteem myself from within. Half the world's riddled with low self-esteem or sitting in better than. And I'm often asked the question, how do you esteem yourself from within? And I say very simple: you do esteemable acts. That is, you put yourself first, not selfishly, but you look after yourself first, and you only do the things that are going to nurture you before you actually go out and do anything for anyone else. Because you see, this model of developmental immaturity is often relates back to codependency. And codependency is, I'm going to look after all of you before I do anything for me. And when I look after all of you and don't do anything for me, I get very resentful very quickly and very angry very quickly. And if I'm from a system where I'm not allowed to show any emotions, which generally that'll be part of it, you'll stuff your anger and it'll come out sideways as rage. Do you see how that presenting problem then comes out? Because we're not taking care of accepting that we're of value. So that's the first aspect of the model of developmental immaturity. The second one is being vulnerable. Now, children, by their very nature, need to be appropriately vulnerable. They are appropriately vulnerable. They don't know how to do things. They need to be taught things. They need to have limits set on, you know, it's time to go to bed now. It's time to do this now. It's okay to cry. You know, and we've got decades and decades of certainly men and some women too, who are terribly traumatised, who never cry about anything. Heavens only knows where those tears disappear to, because they don't go away. And if you're not allowed to be appropriately vulnerable in your family system, let's just say you're primary age and you go to school and the two systems, your two best friends tell you that they don't want to be a friend anymore, and you're 7 or 8, and you hold it together all day, and then you finally get home, you throw the bag in the house when you get in the house, and you burst into tears, and mum or dad says to you, what's happened? And you say, well, Mary and Jane don't want to be my friends anymore. And you're in floods of tears. You held it together all day. You don't want anyone else to see you cry at school because you don't want them to know how important it is to you. And you're shamed for having the emotion. Well, don't worry about them. I don't like their mothers anyway. Let's go and play with that person. Mary over there is a better friend to be because I like her mother. So your emotions are pushed to one side. Now, if it happens once and your parents apologise, fair enough, because everything's imperfect about parenting, I can assure you of that. But that if it happens repeatedly, you learn at a very young age to not show any vulnerability. Now, one of the questions, interestingly, that's just come forward is the model good for complex PTSD? Well, I would answer yes, because what we're dealing with on so many levels with this model is that complex PTSD is not just about one event, one traumatic event in your life that leads you to need help. It is about having a layer of various events that happen to you so that you end up in a complex traumatic space and are often being triggered by various things, none of which make sense because you can't actually remember what the first one was, you never mind about what the fourth thing was. And when dealing with people at South Pacific, what I hear time and time again through the trauma lens is that it's often the people that are traumatised as children that then experience ongoing trauma throughout their life, and it's largely because nobody ever teaches them how to protect themselves, and no adult is protecting them when they're children. They're never taught how to do that. They're never taught to put themselves first. They're never ever taught that no means no and yes means yes. And there's a lot of conflicting information given to them, so they end up in a state of confusion. Now, the thing about the second part of the nature of a child being appropriately vulnerable is if you are not allowed to be appropriately vulnerable, you will not learn boundaries. Boundaries are things that keep us safe. So you can see how critical it is that if we're not allowed to be appropriately vulnerable, nobody teaches us boundaries. We will then go to a space of being too vulnerable, that is, we have no boundaries, or we go to invulnerable where we have walls. Now, when Pia talks about this, you're going to see some of my fabulous stick figures just quietly. Now, you should be prepared for this. When we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about two types of boundaries. We're talking about an external boundary that moves. So if you're standing at the ATM machine and someone's too close to you and you don't feel comfortable and you turn around and say, listen, could you step back a bit? It's usually because they've got their head in their phone. They're not paying attention to how close they are. They'll step back. If you're with your partner, you're going to, have your partner next to you. That's okay. You're close. You're with your kids. You're going to hug your kids, right? So your external boundary moves depending on who you're talking to and who you're with. And if you watch yourself when you're standing at the checkout of anything, any sort of shop, you'll find that some people you'll be quite comfortable to stand quite close to, and others you actually feel very uncomfortable and you'll find yourself stepping back. And it can be the same in social situations. Children who are not allowed to be appropriately vulnerable do not learn to trust that inner knowing with themselves. So they have an external boundary, and then of course the critical one is the internal boundary. Now the internal boundary is from your heart to your abdomen. Protects your truth. So when someone says something to you that's not appropriate, or perhaps they attack, or they're a bit inappropriate in some of the things they say, or a bit harsh, if you have no boundaries, you'll take it on as a truth. if you have an appropriate internal boundary, you'll think, hang on a second. You may not say anything at the moment, but you know, the questions we ask ourselves when someone's attacking us, for example, or speaking inappropriately to us, is it true what they're saying? Is it not true? Or is it questionable? Now, if it's true, you're going to know it. So if, you know, you go out to coffee with a friend and you're always late, and they say to you, you're always late, you know, I'm so angry, you're always late, I'm waiting here, and you're not. And if you know that's the truth, you'll get it. Yeah, that's actually right. If it's not true, you'll actually say, well, hang on a second, I'm late this time. I wasn't late the last 4 times we've met. But if you're not sure, you might actually have to hit a pause button and go and check it out with someone else, or sit down and talk to them about it. But you don't take on anything that's not yours if you've got a firm internal boundary. Now, children that are raised in families where they have no ability to set a boundary, and they're not taught how to do it, will do that. No boundaries or invulnerable. And the walls keep us so separate from everybody. We don't let anything in. We rarely give anything out. So trying to have a relationship with someone who's walled is very difficult, particularly if you are in touch with some of your emotions. I often think the interesting thing about boundaries, you know, PMLD maintain there's 5 values of the children. We've gone through 2. One's self-esteem, and the second, one's being valuable, the second one's being vulnerable. And she maintained that if you could get on top of being of value to yourself and setting boundaries, you would learn healthy self-esteem, and you would learn boundaries, and you are more than halfway there to recovery from codependency. And I think that's such a big statement to make when people come into our facility, and you know, in therapy even, they don't have any sense of where they begin and end in the world. They're not able to regulate in any way, and they feel like they're buffeted around on some sort of ocean of life without an ability to say anything about how they want to be treated in the world. So if we're too vulnerable, we've got no boundaries. If we're invulnerable, we've got walls. But the trick about boundaries is this, and I had someone in the practice today who was talking to me about boundaries, and he said, I'm really good at work, I'm really good at, you know, in the strata meeting, I'm really good, I can set boundaries, I can speak up myself, but I go home to my wife, no boundaries. No ability to set a boundary. So it looks like you have boundaries, but in certain circumstances you don't. And in the world of codependency, we call them fragmented boundaries. So you just got to look at how it is that you're relating to the people in your life. If you are able to set boundaries at work, you know, you can negotiate stuff with the boss or with your colleagues, and then you go home and you've got none, you know where the work has to be done. It needs to be done in your intimate relationships. And of course, that's going to be the one that's always hard for most of us, because that's where we're exposed and open. We have the same presenting problems as I mentioned before, all those addictions and mood disorders, complex PTSD. And we need to get to a place where we can protect and contain ourselves. And we can only do that by understanding where I begin and end and where you begin and end. And it's a very big one for many people in recovery, from codependency, from complex PTSD, and from addictions. The third one is that we're perfectly imperfect, which we all are. And if you're not allowed to be imperfect as a child, you won't sit in reality. Now, the interesting thing about this is, if you're constantly criticised for making a mistake, or you're constantly put down for just being a child, because, you know, kids make mistakes, they spill milk, they lose their jumpers, they do all sorts of stuff. I mean, that's just part of being a kid. And God, we love them all not to be doing that, because it's a hassle sometimes. But the truth of it is that when we were kids, we did the same thing, because it's all about the process of learning. Now, in being imperfect, if we are not allowed to be imperfect, this is where we don't sit in reality. Now, there's four parts of this in reality. There's body, thinking, feelings or emotions, and behaviour. There's a lot of depth to this part, because if we're talking about body, thinking, feelings, behaviour, the body will be things like, do I see myself in reality? When I look at myself in the mirror, what do I see? I had a client who couldn't look at her face because every time she looked at her face, she saw her father. Massive body dysmorphia going on. This is where a lot of disordered eating comes in. Not in reality about, you know, what I look like, what I need. There are two aspects for this. There's I know, but I won't tell. And the second aspect is I don't know. And there's two aspects to each one. So, for example, with the body, it's I know, but I won't tell. That is, I know that I'm eating in a disordered way, but I'm not telling anyone. I'm going to keep it a secret. And the second one is I'm totally out of touch with myself. I don't even know that I'm in disordered eating. It will happen also with exercise. So a lot of people do very addicted to their exercise. And I know there'll be many of you that will go, yeah, but it keeps my head straight and it's all great. And I'm not saying don't exercise. That's not what I'm saying. But if it becomes a critical issue for you, it's just something. It's like if we're living at the extremity, right? Thinking is whether I'm able to think clear thoughts, whether I'm out of control with my thinking, or whether I'm shut down in my thinking. So it's always at the extreme in this. You know, I know but won't tell, or I don't know. The two aspects again. I know that my thinking's it's chaotic, but I'm not telling anybody. And the second one is I don't even know that I'm in it. Feelings and emotions, well, this will be where we have our emotions and our feelings, and they're either out of control or there's none. Same thing, it's the extremity. I know but won't tell, or I don't know. So if I know it won't tell, it's when I know my feelings are out of control. I don't know how to manage them. I don't know how to regulate them. I use substances to do that. It can often happen with addiction. It can often happen with ADHD. Not going to say anything to anyone. Or I don't even know because I'm so disconnected from myself. And the behaviour is reflective of the three before. So the reality about this is if I'm not allowed to be imperfect and I don't sit in reality in those four areas, I will go to two spaces. I will go to bad rebellious or good perfect. Now the bad rebellious could be the disordered eating. The bad rebellious could be overly critical thinking of myself and others. The bad rebellious in terms of emotions is they're explosives, right? So the only time I have any is when I lose myself and have a rage attack. And the behaviour, of course, will bad rebellious addicts know all about bad rebellious behaviour because they do it when they're in their active addiction. But the people that suffer with depression and anxiety, their bad rebellious might be, well, I'm just going to go to bed for 3 days with a depression. I'm not going to tell anyone or contact anyone. So you see how it's always at the extreme. And the other side of it is good perfect, where I zip it up. I'm very good about what I eat. I'm on a really strict diet. I'm very strict regime of exercise. I'll do it for 3 months and then the whole thing goes pear-shaped. Thinking will be the same. I'm reading spiritual books. I'm doing meditation. I'm only doing this, you know. So very controlling about my good perfect thinking. Feelings and emotions is the same. And behaviour, of course, the good perfect behaviour is I look, you know, tickety-boo and all fabulous, but I'm not being real with myself because, you know, let's face it, I know too many people that are good perfect all the time, and if they are, they're pretty boring to be around, is my opinion. So I'd rather someone who is authentic than someone who is pretending to be something they're not. Again, the presenting problems are the same in terms of addiction, mood disorders. And the very simple solution for this is we accept we're imperfect, accept imperfection in self and others. So I'm actually accepting I'm imperfect. I've got to tell you, from the time that I actually started to actually be okay with making mistakes in my life, because 99.9% of them are not life-threatening, I was actually okay with it. It didn't matter to me that there was, it didn't matter to me that I made a mistake. So another question's come through. If you have a wall up, is it possible to have a wall up protecting your truth, but the truth is not your truth, it's someone else's? Well, of course, that's exactly what we do. If you're protecting someone else's truth, you're carrying other people's emotional pain. And that can be in the form of shame, pain, anger, fear, loneliness. The wall up protecting your truth but someone else's, wow, that's a painful place to be. But I guess it comes back to, doesn't it, if we're living in a family where there's secrets or people aren't actually telling the truth about what is actually happening, there's no communication. But children, my experience of children and working with adults who then come into South Pacific to address their childhood trauma, the children knew there was something amiss in the family system. They may not have known what it was. Dad was having an affair, mum was having an affair or taking pills or something, but the child knew something was not right. So often carrying that is a very painful place to be. Sorry, I just had the boss send me a text. I don't actually need to read that right now. Sorry. When the nature of a child is questioned, both primary symptoms are activated. Is it possible to feel better than without also feeling less than? Absolutely. My experience of people who sit in better than, my experience of it is that they will present as better than, but underneath, if you can work with them, and it's harder to work with someone who sits in better than it is in less than, because the less than people are messy and they know it. But the better than ones present as all together. But when you work underneath it, you'll find that they too live with tremendous wounds from their childhood and a tremendous sense of being less than. Okay, I'm just going to leave it. As a person in active recovery and looking to start a family, what would you suggest reading, doing to try and break the generational cycle of trauma and ensure that how you're parenting is doing the least possible damage? I know we won't be perfect, but how can you be the best you can be? The best you can be is stay in recovery. That'll be the number one. And the second one would be, I would suggest reading Facing Codependency, which is what this covers, and perhaps doing a little bit of trauma work if you've got trauma in your history. It sounds like you do. And I'm a big fan of not passing on, because, I mean, I've been in recovery all of my daughter's life. My daughter's now 31. Yes, I don't look old enough to have a 31-year-old. I know that. You don't have to tell me. But even being in recovery, because I had trauma in my own history that had not been fully put to rest and integrated, it made her life a little bit difficult, and I've had to go back and make amends to her. So I totally understand this concept. And I can't tell you how many people come into South Pacific to do trauma work because they don't want to actually injure or damage or pass on to their children what was passed on to them. Intergenerational trauma is a massive part of this. The next one is being dependent. Now, there are 9 dependency needs. I was surprised when I learnt this. I thought we had food, clothing, shelter. But there's food, clothing, shelter, medical attention, dental attention, spiritual direction. I should remember the other 3, and right now they don't come to mind. Emotional nurturing, physical nurturing, and spiritual direction. They're the 9. And if you missed any of those, there's a fairly high probability that you did not learn that it's appropriate to be dependent. We are interdependent on each other as a species. That's the way it is. And if we don't learn, if those needs aren't met, and for children that are terribly traumatised, many of them aren't, they will be too dependent or they'll be anti-dependent. Now, if they're too dependent, it's like they sort of suck the life force out of you. We probably commonly say they're very, very needy people, and they're often very difficult to be around if you're not a needy person. And the anti-dependent are walled big time. They don't, it's like, I have no needs and wants, And if I have them, I don't know what they are. I'm not going to ask for them to be held. So there's a lot of, in this one, I'm needless and wantless. I know I have needs and wants, but I want you to take care of them for me. I wait, expecting you to look after me, as I don't know how to do it myself. There will be people that get their needs and wants confused. This is a good one. I used to do this one. So, for example, you come home from work, you've had a big day at work, and you're exhausted, right? But you're not used to asking for anything. So you walk into home, and partner's there, and they say, how was your day? Oh, yeah, good, yeah. And what you really want, I should speak about myself, what I really want is a hug and a cup of tea. Maybe a foot massage wouldn't be a bad idea either, but I'd settle for the hug and a cup of tea. But I don't ask for the hug and the cup of tea. I don't say, could we take 10 minutes before we have to think about dinner? I go straight into the office at home, and I jump online, and what do? I buy $500 worth of shoes, because I want to get some sort of hit, because I'm depleted. I've spent all day giving to everybody else. I haven't taken care of myself. I then get home, I don't ask for any needs to be met, and so I get my needs and wants confused. And the shoes arrive, how many days later? I feel fabulous for about 5 minutes, and guess what? The need's still there. So it is to be aware of and appropriately meet the needs of self first and others. And sometimes the needs aren't big. It's like, I need to rest, I need a hug, I need a cup of tea, I need to go and sit in the sun. They're not big needs. But if I'm not in tune with myself, I won't ask for them. And I do that, when I'm running a group, I often say to the group, when they do their check-in, do you have any needs? And they all look at me like, need? I don't, what do you mean? What do you mean? Do I have any? Do you need anything right now? No? Okay, good. That's great. And often it's the first time they've ever differentiated between a want and a need. Because you see, most of the time we'll get what we want, but we won't get what we need because we're not aware of it. The next one, let me see what questions we've got coming through. As a person in activity, right, I've done that one, yeah, done that one. I think that's good. Right. In being authentic, I'm trying to... Right, okay. No, we can leave those. We'll come back to them. The next one is to be spontaneous and open. Now, children are spontaneous and open by their very nature. And I'm sure you all have all heard that they found Chloe, the little 4-year-old who was taken. And I have to tell you, I was walking home from the dog park, and it came up on my phone, the alert that she'd been found, and I stopped dead in the street with the dog on my hand, and I was walking with a friend of mine, and my friend stopped and went, what? And I went, oh my God, look, they found her. And I was really quite emotional about it, and I'm sure many of you have been too. And I was thinking about, and then later tonight, as I listened to the news, because I wanted to just check out if she was, how she was doing and things, and how her folks were and everything. And I thought to myself, one of the police officers, I think, described her as very happy, and she's like the Energizer Bunny. Now, I have a friend of mine whose husband, I refer to him as an Energizer Bunny because he's got a lot of energy. But I was delighted, and that's the nature of a child, isn't it? To be spontaneous and open and playful. And if we are allowed to be spontaneous and open and playful, in whatever way we do that as children, we learn moderation. We learn limits. And often people who sit in better than have never had a limit put on them. They're held up as being the hero of the family, often with a wound, but you don't know about that until you're older. And we don't sit with any sort of sense of moderation. Now, when I first started working with this model, that was the one word in the model I didn't like, was moderation. And for those of you that know me, you'll understand why, because I was never very moderate myself until I got into recovery. But the two primary symptoms we get out of that is we go into out of control or controlling. So if you think about the 4 levels we're working on, body, thinking, feelings, behaviour, when we're out of control physically, we're likely to be doing anything. When we're out of control with our thinking, with our feelings, and with our behaviour. And then that's on the wounded child side. And then when we go to the other extreme and we're controlling our body, controlling what we eat, controlling our exercise, controlling what we look like, controlling our thinking, controlling our feelings, which usually means we're split off from them, and controlling our behaviour. And often people will say they'll be applauded for being the very highly organised person at work, and I'm pretty organised myself, but I certainly wouldn't put myself in the controlling category anymore, although in past years I would have said that about myself. Because often when we're in control, if you've been a traumatised child or you've come from this sort of history, to be in control means you feel safe. There is no way that you don't, the only way you can exercise over your life is to control the outcome of things. And of course it doesn't work. It's an illusion, but that's what we think is going to happen. Again, the same presenting problems. And of course, often the functional adult needs to be spontaneous, open and moderate. Now, it's a really hard call for someone who's never been allowed to be spontaneous and open in the beginning. If you're from an addicted or traumatised family, or you've experienced abuse as a child, there's no way you're going to be spontaneous and open, because you're waiting for the other shoe to drop all the time, I mean, I can remember going home myself from school. I never knew what was going to be happening at home when I went in. I didn't know what I was walking into. It was going to be dead quiet because, mum was catatonically drunk, or out of control because she was right out of control with her drinking. Never knew what was going to happen. And it will be the same for many people who have that experience. I want to also just ask, sorry, I'm just pulling up another question here. Oh, I've lost you, Kathleen. Where am I? Sorry, Kathleen, here we go. What's an example of a healthy limit? Working 8 hours a day and not 16. There you go. Having a couple of days off and resting. Asking for someone to go for a walk with you because you're feeling a bit on your own. I mean, I don't think healthy limits need to be a big deal. I don't think they need to be enormous, but they do need to be from a place where you sit and have your own need met first. And most of the time, in my life, when I've asked for people to support me in some way, I have always taken the view that the worst I'm going to get is a no. And I rarely get it. I'll often have people say, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to do that for you. Or, no, I can't do it Tuesday, but I can do it Wednesday. So there's ways of actually being able to set a healthy limit for yourself. I think probably taking a step back from that is coming back to the question of what do you need? What do you need to do to take care of yourself? What does that look like? And for many of us who are making a very early foray into this area, that can be a hard question to answer. And often we need a little bit of help and guidance. I want to come back to how do I stop worrying about what I've done as a parent? I just started reading Pia's codependency book, but got overwhelmed feeling I may have done that to my son. Yes, I totally understand that. I'm not sure how old your son is, but if he's of an age where you can talk to him, I would certainly speak to him. And I'd probably get some help from a therapist to do that, just to get clear about not then overtly putting too much pressure on him to take no, you want to take responsibility for everything. That doesn't help either. My experience of people who've gone into recovery who may have not been the best parents, been the parents they wanted to be, may have not had a chance to look at their own trauma and therefore inadvertently pass it on to their kids, the best way to deal with it is go back and do your own trauma work. And I want to do another little one of my fabulous diagrams, which I know you're all loving. And this is about carried feelings, because I think it's important to understand this. And I'm just going to do a generic story. It's not, it's not specific gender. I'm just going to talk mum, dad, you. So will you allow me a little latitude while I do that? Because I don't want to get into too much non-binary stuff right now. I just want to tell a story. So let's just say this is you, your primary age kid. Things aren't great at home. You're kind of getting by, but it's not an easy fit. And so mum, she does her best, but she's, got a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain between them, mum and dad. You don't know what's going on, but it's not right, whatever it is. And so when mum feels her pain, here's my other pen, hang on. She feels her pain, she feels her fear, and she feels her anger. But she's irresponsible with them. So let's just say you're coming home late from school. Others will have heard this story, and forgive me for those of you that have. So you're coming home late from school a lot, and she's getting a bit worried about you. And she says to you, look, I want you to come straight home from school. I don't want you to kick the ball around the oval. I don't want you to sit and chat to your girlfriend. I want you to come straight home from school because I'm worried about how things are, right? You go, yeah, right. She says, there'll be consequences if you don't. Yeah, right. So for the next sort of 2 weeks, you come home straight from school. And then one afternoon you get caught and you're sitting on the bench chatting to your girlfriend, and suddenly you go, oh my God, I'm late. And you pick up your bag and you race home, maybe half an hour later. You throw the bag, I'm sorry, I'm not. So she's furious. She doesn't actually do anything about that, except she says to you, go to your room and wait till your father gets home. That's never a good thing to hear, right? Because Dad's pretty out of control. Dad's a bit of a rager. He doesn't do much else but rage. He works hard and he drinks a bit. Maybe he's an alkie, maybe he isn't. Maybe he's got his own trauma, I don't know. But he rages, and that's what you've experienced from him, and the rest of the time he's pretty absent. So when he finally gets home a couple of hours later, in your room, this is not going to end well, right? And in whatever way he disciplines you, and it could be yelling, screaming, hitting, whatever he does, you actually absorb some of his rage. Because when a child is criticised or abused by a parent, they don't think you're out of control. What they think is, I have made you so angry, you are screaming at me now. This is my fault. So the child does not love the parent less, they love themselves less. Mum is in another part of the house. She's actually started this. She perpetuates it, right? She doesn't protect you from it. And so you absorb her unfelt pain, fear, and anger. In the codependency world, we call this behaviour shameless. So you absorb their shame as well. So you as a child absorb the emotions and feelings of your parents that they don't own. You then grow up to be an adult it hasn't gone away. It's still there. And so when you learn not to feel your feelings, you learn not to you learn not to set boundaries. You don't understand that you're valuable. You don't understand that you are imperfect. You don't understand that you have 9 dependency needs, and you don't understand that you need to be spontaneous over it. As an adult person, you're walking around with a whole bunch of stuff going on that's not yours. So when that question came through about how do I stop worrying about what I've done as a parent, it is overwhelming to get into this stuff. With assistance, you can navigate your way through it. Of that, I'm absolutely sure. I've done it myself, and I know many others who have too. And when we've talked earlier about wanting to break the generation cycle of trauma to ensure that your parenting is doing the least damage possible, it is the same thing. You do your own trauma work and you'll allow your children to walk into freedom, because they don't. need to carry your stuff, which is what they'd be doing. Now, I reckon I did a back of the envelope calculation one day of how many trauma processes I'd done at South Pacific, and I came up with over 1,000. It's probably more now because I did that a year or so ago. One of the things I know about parents and the stories I have heard in detail, I might tell you, is that there's a very, very, very few percent, a small percentage of parents who actually mean to harm their children. Most everybody is only living out of what they have not been able to resolve in their own previous generations, because it comes down the line. That's just the way it is. But the beautiful thing about living in 2021 is we actually get a choice about whether we want to do the work and walk in a freedom or not. Our parents and their generation before them and their generation before them, they didn't have that choice. We have that choice. So I'm going to finish up now. I want to say a couple more things. I hope it's been helpful. I also want to just say we now have a new family support group which they've started at South Pacific. It's a weekly support group. It's for families, partners, friends and carers of people experiencing addiction or mental health, and it's available to everyone. So I think that would be very helpful. In fact, a couple of my clients told me they were going to do it, and I think that's wonderful, because you can see what the addiction and mental illness is doing to your loved one. Can you see what it does to you? And oftentimes the family members don't realise they need as much support as the person who's suffering from the addiction or the mental illness. So if any of you are struggling with that, I'd suggest you reach out to South Pacific. The Family Support Group is what it's called. And of course there's a myriad of other day programs and of course changes. And very soon we start doing the first 5-day experiential love addiction, love avoidant workshop for those of you that are experiencing relational issues. And we'll be running that one. We're rolling that out in a couple of short weeks, and then there'll be quite regular 5-day workshops throughout next year, 2022. So I think that's brought me to an end. Any Detached with Love book recommendations. That's working with a family member who's obviously in trouble. And if that's the case, I mean, I wouldn't be a bit remiss not to mention Al-Anon if you feel like you could manage that. But I do think the Facing Codependency by Pia Mellody is probably the go-to first book. There's a lot of other books available. Healing the Shame That Binds by Bradshaw, Homecoming by Bradshaw, Russell Brand's book on recovery. There's a lot of books in the wind that would be helpful. So I think that's probably brought us to a close. I want to really thank you all for logging on. I really appreciate your support. It's always nerve-wracking for me before I start these things, and then once I start talking, I feel like I'm never going to stop. So I'm going to wind it up now. Please feel free to reach out to South Pacific for any support you think you may need. The intake team is always very happy to take your calls. The day programs are some are still run on Zoom and some are face-to-face, so that's a good thing. And we're constantly looking at ways that we can facilitate people moving through this sort of trauma. Changes is also being run as a standalone. That's the experiential 5-day workshop that works with your childhood trauma. That's a 5-day standalone program. You don't have to be in South Pacific doing the 3-week program if you can't manage that. So I want to thank you for the time you've taken tonight. I wish you all the very best, and thank you for logging on.